Hi, everybody. What we're going to be looking at today is just as a little background. I'm an architect, and my firm.
And I'm not.
And I'm not a rabbi. My firm has a specialty in synagogue design. So this is going to be structured as a review of modern synagogue ark designs. And each type will be having a kind of a case study of arks that my firm has done that relates to what we're talking about. So I think, Rabbi, you were going to start off with a little bit of a framing of what we're doing today.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Great to be with you, and great to be with all of you and all of you online. I want to start with just by taking us to the book of Exodus, where we have a few indications about the ark. There are precious few details about what we need for our sanctuary today, which is amazing because we have a whole lot of Torah about the Mishkan and measurements and details about what it means to have a tabernacle in ancient Israel. For us today, not that much, but I wanted to lift up something because our focus is on the ark design. I wanted to lift up a little bit that is there about the ark in the Torah. You may remember there's a description of two cherubim on the ark in the Torah. We're not even sure what a cherub is. Maybe it's the naked baby, but maybe not. And probably in Torah, it's more like, the understanding is more like a protector. It could be an angel or a bird. And the idea of the cherubim is that perhaps there's one on each side protecting. Perhaps they're looking at each other. There's a sense that they're facing each other. And so maybe that means they're facing Torah. Maybe it means they're facing each other's faces, like they're in relationship. Maybe there's something about the ark that calls to mind our relationships with each other, facing each other. And there's also an interpretation that they're facing nothing, that there's just space in between them, and that space is not a bad thing, that we don't have to spell everything out, and that things can be open for interpretation. So with all of that in mind from our Torah, I wanted to just offer the concept of the mitzvah of hidor mitzvah. Hidor mitzvah means the elevation or the beautification of a mitzvah. And as much as our tradition has concern about graven images, that we don't actually worship images, we also have hidor mitzvah, which means to beautify, that there is value in the aesthetic, that I could make kiddush out of, just a plastic cup, a Dixie cup, or that Tropicana bottle, right? Like, great. That would do the trick for kiddush. And yet we encourage artists to interpret and to have some kind of spiritual creativity to elevate and bring more beauty to the mitzvah. And that's true, that we'll see today, that's true of synagogue design, of sanctuary design, and of today's focus, ark design. And so inspired by hidor mitzvah, we get to learn a little bit more with Mike's beautiful examples.
Thanks, Rabbi. That was great. I also want to start following up on that a little bit by, I don't know how many of you remember that several years ago, the museum here, the PMJA, had an exhibit where they invited a dozen artists to do their interpretation of a mezuzah. And it really resonated with me. It was fantastic. And some of the artists weren't Jewish even, and they knew that what the very few things that a mezuzah had to be, and the interpretation of what it could be. And it got me thinking a lot about that, because for a religion that has a lot of rules and 613 commandments, the ritual pieces that we all use have such a wide variety of design that there's so many other things you can do besides just the function of that piece. When you think about the variety of Seder plates and Kiddush cups and like everything that you can think of that we use, in our ritual, the interpretation is amazing. So there's plenty of room for that. So thinking about designing arks, and as Rabbi Maderer said, there's not a lot to go on here. I mean, there aren't a lot of rules here. So it's very personal. And I'm going to start with trying to get this to move forward. Okay.
Did we thank Jordan?
Oh, I think
We
you
did.
did.
And Stephen?
It worked a minute ago,
It did work a minute. There we go. Should I use that instead?
maybe.
All right. What did you click? Okay. So what we've realized doing these things is that there's three types of arcs. There's the arc as architecture, meaning it's designed by the architect as part of the building. You can't take it with you. You can't move it somewhere else. It's built by the contractor when they're building the building. It's not, it's part of the architecture of the building. What did you click?
Screen sharing has.
Pull up a seat.
Okay. My screen back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Get that to come back. Hit the
Current slide.
Yeah.
Keys.
the thing way down at the bottom, all to the right, to the left. There. Okay. Now what did you do to advance it?
Should be able to just click that or try this. I'm sorry. There we
Okay.
go.
Yeah.
I'll use that now. Okay. We'll try everything. All right. So the second thing is the ark as cabinetry or furniture. So this is something that is like a cabinet that sits on the bima, that it's made maybe offsite by a woodworking shop or maybe the architect designed it too, but it's something that isn't part of the building and it's made by somebody who brings it in. And the third type of ark is ark as art or sculpture, where it's commissioned piece. It's obviously done by an artist, and it could be made later and brought in, and so that these three types we're going to look at each type and talk about them. So let's talk about art as architecture. This is a synagogue in Milwaukee. The architect is a guy named Philip Katz. And as you can see, this is a room where the walls are made out of these panels holding paintings by Toby Kahn. And if you may not realize it, there's one right outside in our hallway, a Toby Kahn painting. And every one of these panels has one of these paintings as its walls. And then the one in the middle is the ark. That's going to be the permanent part of this. And if you look at that kind of window above the ark, that is the Ner Tamid, the eternal light that glows. And it's a spectacular type of room. And again, during the day, the ark is part of the architecture of that room that can't be, separated, but it works with every other element in the room that way. Here's a synagogue in Tel Aviv by an architect named Mario Botta, who is a fairly famous Swiss architect. And what's fascinating to me about this is you're looking at this sanctuary, which is a square room. And then there's these kind of curved lights coming from above. Like, how does that happen? We'll get to that in a minute. But the ark is surrounded by very thin onyx stone, which is so thin that the sunlight comes through it. if that were glass, you'd be able to see outside, but it's onyx. And it just is this glowing, beautiful stone surround around the ark. And you probably can't see it from, and now you can. Rabbi, do you want to talk about the whole issue of what it says above arks often?
Sure. There are some favorite texts. Like we said, nothing's prescribed. If you picture our beautiful sanctuary, you'll remember perhaps there's no text right above the ark, right? So it's not even every ark that would have a text. The text that's chosen for above this ark is, if you squint, Shaviti Adonai Lenegdi Tamid. So it's from the Psalms. It's familiar because the text that has been chosen for our sanctuary is on the top of the pendentives, the four corners, same text. So this is one of those common ark texts that instead was chosen for our sanctuaries, pendentives. Shaviti is the upper, if you're on the bima, Shaviti is the upper left. So you go Shaviti Adonai Lenegdi Tamid. And it's that, here it's a focal point. In our sanctuary, you could almost miss it if you didn't know to look up. I mean, hopefully you do look up in our sanctuary because there's so much to see with the dome. It's in the ceiling. It's so beautiful, but it's not the first thing that people notice. I just spent the last couple of days with rabbinic colleagues from the Reform movement from all over the country who are planning for their, in a year and a half, their national convention to be in Philadelphia. And so we hosted them at Rosh Shalom for part of the day. And I got to take them into our sanctuary. And it was like sort of on their way out that they noticed that text. There's so much to take in. So, but this is different. This is much more central here, I think, the text.
Oh, and it means
sorry. Shaviti Adonai Lenegdi Tamid is, Shaviti is I set, Adonai, is
Adonai.
God, right? I set God before me always.
Okay. Now, the reason that there's curved light coming down is because of these sort of crazy skylights on the top of this building. And this architect is particularly known for his sort of odd shapes. But each one of those, one is over the sanctuary, the other one's over the social hall, and that's why you're getting that curved sunlight on the walls. A little closer to home, this is maybe some of you have been there. It's Beth Am Israel in Penn Valley by Voith McTavish, and similar to the one that has the Toby Kahn paintings around it. The ark is built in there, and there's a window above it. It doesn't have the Ner Tamid in it, but it does kind of focus, even from the outside, where the ark is on this particular building because of the way that the windows are patterned. This synagogue is one of my favorite, and it has Rabbi Maderer has a kind of a special relationship with it. This is in East Hampton, New York, by Norman Jaffe. It's one of my favorite synagogues ever. Beautiful, almost all wood, and it has these great wooden details. What did you say the words around the room were about?
There's a text on top of each of. Can I just?
Yeah.
So. I don't know if friends online can see. On top of what would you call each section here that has like a little light, I think has a little bay window, if I'm remembering correctly. They're on the side. So each of these has a text that is one of God's attributes from this, we wrote the mystical mapping of God's attributes. So, and here you can see it. I think that they're benches.
Yeah, I think
bay window, like the benches is what I meant here and here. Yeah, and here you can see there's a text here.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And
yeah.
And you used to attend this.
So this is, we didn't call it Gates of the Grove.
No, they changed the name.
That must have been a name for the new sanctuary. So this is called, in my family, we call this the new sanctuary because this is the Jewish center of the Hamptons, where my mother's family's from. Oh. So my grandfather and my grandparents were founding members of the congregation when they started their life out in Montauk at the end of Long Island. And my grandfather was an early president of the congregation. This is to the side of the sanctuary is an old house. The old house was the synagogue back in the day, and then it grew and this new beautiful sanctuary was added on. But before this beautiful sanctuary was added on, in that backyard where you can see the greenery through the windows was the first wedding, which was my aunt. The first wedding for the congregation was my aunt. And in the old little house was the first bat mitzvah, which was my mother.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And we used to go, I mean, I used to go there before I had children. When I had my own life, I would go when I visit my family out on Long Island, this is where we go on Shabbat.
Is this Rabbi Gelfand's?
Rabbi David Gelfand was there for years. He is now in New York City. After that, Rabbi Sheldon Zimmerman was there for years. And now Rabbi Josh Franklin, who some of us may remember, interned here some years ago, is their rabbi.
Both my daughter and my son-in-law interned with Rabbi Gelfand at that synagogue, and they were married in that synagogue.
Here?
At this synagogue. And I remember thinking it was like being inside a ship.
Yeah.
Because of
The sheep.
wood.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Love this. And what's interesting is the ark is in this picture. It's very subtle. It barely calls attention to itself, but there it is. And so, as you can see, whereas we look at our ark in our synagogue, and it's very elaborate and carved and all, and this one is about as subtle as you can get. Here's a project that we did. This was a renovation of a synagogue in Orangeburg, New York. And they asked us to renovate their sanctuary. There's the old, what it originally looked like was that. And it included not only renovating it, but expanding it both in length and in width. So what you're looking at, the big picture, that's a new section added to the end, and it's widened. All they really wanted us to do for sure was to keep their stained glass windows. So we took them out and then did this renovation and had to put them back. But the ark and we were able to design the ark and the ark furniture. And if you look carefully at the inscription over the ark, it's our old favorite above the ark, Shaviti Adonai. And for the Ner Tamid, it's the crack in the stone with the light coming through it above the ark. We always wanted to do that. So that is that one, and that's what it looks like from the outside with the windows put back. Moving on to ark as cabinetry or furniture. This is a synagogue in Evanston, Illinois, a Reconstructionist congregation. And this is a great example of the bima being basically a platform, just a lot of windows behind it. And the only thing that creates the sense of place on this bima is that kind of sloped screen that catches a certain amount of light, creates a place. And then next to it is this very basically ornate armoire, which is kind of what it is. And it's a piece that is designed, brought in. There's a Ner Tamid hanging over it, which you can kind of see, which is a little piece of sculpture. And an artist, created the doors. Pretty effective, very kind of austere, but really beautiful in a lot of ways. This is an Orthodox synagogue in Highland Park, New Jersey. And what's fascinating about this one, very, very austere. I wouldn't want to sit on those benches for too long. And the
Mostly standing.
yeah, that's right. Exactly. The ark is that very simple, like almost kind of Japanese soji screen looking thing with this big thing behind it that brings the light down from a skylight that you can't see and illuminates the doors of the ark. And I'm presuming, I can't swear to it, that those screens slide apart to reveal the ark. But this is taking all of the light that comes into that room and focusing it on those arc doors, which is pretty effective. This is a synagogue, Beth Elohim in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Some of you may have been there. It's a pretty spectacular room. And the ark is this kind of suspended capsule that is the focus of the room. I was telling Rabbi Maderer that I've been in groups looking at this picture where people who have been in it, and one person says that it was the most beautiful sanctuary they've ever been in, and another person in the room says it was the coldest, most unpleasant space they could imagine. So all of these things are open to very personal interpretation. But that ark really stands out as the focus of that room. It's pretty big scale too, and that's what their room looks like from the outside. I really like it. I think it's beautiful. Anyone who's ever taken a course in Modern Architecture 101 in college will know this building. It's it's a synagogue in Portchester, New York, by Philip Johnson. I think most of you have heard by Philip Johnson. He's the guy who did the glass house, in Connecticut. It was pretty famous. He did the Seagram's building in New York. He was a very well-known mid-century modern architect who lived to be like 102. And this was the Portchester Synagogue. It's always shown on these, mid-century architecture courses. And here, the ark is basically a cabinet, sits on the bima. Behind it is this screen that an artist did made up of like wire sculptures, essentially, that I don't think it's representational particularly. I think it's just a design. Very interesting, sort of like, it's not symmetrical, but it's a balanced composition with, you got the Ner Tamid hanging off the side and all that. And the thing about this room is it's pretty straightforward, but the ceiling looks like a tent. I mean, that was the interpretation by Philip Johnson of the interior of the synagogue should somehow reflect the idea of a tent. The exterior, there it is in a kind of a wider view. The exterior, it's basically a box with an entrance. And it's so when you get inside is when you get this kind of softer image of the building. Unfortunately, somebody had the great idea of renovating the interior, and they pretty much redid the whole bima into a much, what I think is less compelling design. It's a little too static for me. And I thought that was a shame they did that. But, things change. Yes.
So I'm used to thinking of the Ner Tamid as being in the center, but I think you've shown us two examples at least where it's on the side.
No rules.
Is it unusual to not have? No, so I just all over.
Yeah, and I'm going to show you examples where the Ner Tamid is part of the ark. Is actually part of the ark itself. Here's a project we did. This is a Reformed congregation in Malvern. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's been out there, but this was the congregation's first building. Until they built this, they were sharing a renovated Chester County barn with a Presbyterian congregation. One took Sunday and one took Saturday, and they told us that they wanted their space to reflect their original beginnings. They didn't want it to look like a barn, but they wanted to invoke some of that feeling in either the materials or how it was structured. So we came up with this. And for the ark, there's a little more of the exterior. We have stone and wood and exposed rafters and things like that. For the ark, we designed something made out of kind of rougher hewn lumber and made the doors kind of like barn doors. A little more refined than that, but this was the image that they were kind of looking for. Here's a little sketch of it. One more that we did. This is a project that was just finished. It's in Falls Church, Virginia, Road of Shalom, the Virginia franchise. And we, they're the largest congregation in Virginia, but they only had one room for worship space. It was their sanctuary. They never had like a smaller secondary worship space. So they hired us to design their second room. It wanted to be very flexible, of course. And one of the things we did was we made that glass wall you see to the left-hand side. You're able to open it entirely. So it's not there anymore. And there's a terrace outside so that in nice weather, they wanted to have services out on the terrace. But of course, they needed an ark. So the ark is movable. It's on wheels. So is the reader's table. And the design came from using the same colors that they have in their sanctuary ark, creating a different kind of design. If you look really carefully, you'll see the double yud in the design, which is, I guess, an abbreviation for God's name. Yeah. And then the Ner Tamid is that thing on top, which is wood and glass, and it lights up. It's a little hard to see, but that's the room with the glass wall.
Is there text on the top of it?
Yes, and I don't remember what it says. Can you read that?
Oh, yeah. It's the last line of Psalm 150. Kol haneshama tehalel Yah, hallelujah. Every soul praise God, hallelujah.
Great. I don't know where we just put it there. We were told what they wanted, and
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's not misspelled. Good. Good. Yeah, that came from their rabbi. Yeah.
Is that painted or fabric or?
It's actually a film that's somehow affixed to the glass. It's colored. It's basically colored glass. Yeah. And this was an early rendering when we were first designing it. And at that time, the ark was suspended in a steel frame that was going to run on a track. So you could run it around to those other windows. And everybody looked at that and said, yeah, no, we're not doing that. But we kind of liked it. Finally, in this category as furniture, this is a synagogue we did in New Orleans, which was actually a modern Orthodox congregation that lost their building in Katrina. It was gone. And this was a smaller building that was just outside of town. And the only thing that really survived their Katrina flood was they had the Orthodox congregations, the beam is in the middle and there's sometimes a railing around the reader's table. And that survived, which is still there. You can see in the lower right-hand corner. And we used a lot of the details from that railing to design the ark. And we did, you can see there's also the mechitza that was designed from that as well. And we did a number of designs for this thing, and they picked one of them eventually and shipped it off to Israel, where there's a guy named Gabriel Bass who specializes in Judaica, and he fabricated this ark in Israel, flew it here in pieces, and assembled it in this building. It was great. It was really interesting. So he reinterpreted essentially our design with our kind of like correspondence back and forth. And you can see there's this kind of glass at the top of the finished one, and that's the Ner Tamid. And the quote at the top, I'm going to depend on you for the Hebrew. If you could read it.
This is the one
Oh, you didn't know this?
right? Isn't the unusual?
I think it's from Pirkei Avot, I was told. And it says, it's interpreted as, mighty waters will not extinguish our love, which is an amazing quote.
That I would say there's no other ark that has that, right? That's like the hurricane survival text. It's unusual.
That was really cool. We really like that. And that's what the outside looks like. trying to make it feel like it's in New Orleans a little bit. And this is the famous photograph of the floras. And I'm pretty sure I remember that none of them were able to be salvaged. Yeah. Okay. Art as sculpture, ark as art. So new category. And here's a synagogue in Ohio by Centerbrook Architects, who are from Connecticut, actually. And this is just, I love this one. I mean, it's kind of wild and crazy, but it soars. I mean, you can't miss it. It's part of the room. It's sculpture. It's somebody designed this, for maximum sort of awe when you're in this room. And I've always thought this was, just beautiful. I'm not sure how it stands up, but okay, that wasn't my problem. Here's another ark that is the original building. Has everybody here heard about Walter Gropius? Do you know the name Walter Gropius? Walter Gropius was a Bauhaus architect. And he and a bunch of other architects of that era fled Germany. And he did this synagogue in Baltimore. And this is not the original ark from this building. They renovated it. Levin Brown, who was a Baltimore architect, did it. And what you probably can't see exactly is that if you look really, really carefully at the leaves and the branches of the trees, it's the Hebrew kadosh, 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 Adonai Tsevaot is up in there. And that's pretty cool. I don't like the idea that you can see inside entirely. It doesn't, you want some background on that tree. But anyway, that's art as sculpture. This is an interesting one. This is in Great Neck, New York. And this entire wall is done by Louise Nevelson. And you can't quite see it because it's so well done, but some of those panels slide. And beautiful. Again, there's a Ner Tamid above it, pretty traditional, I guess. And then there's this one, which Rabbi Maderer also has connection to. This is a synagogue in Buffalo, New York, by Harrison and Abramovitz, who are the architects. You want to talk a little bit about your connection here?
So two connections. One is when I was a rabbinical student, I served as an intern at this congregation, one of the summers of rabbinical school. And so I did a lot of my training on that bima, actually. And the other, and I have wonderful memories. It's a really wonderful congregation. And it was one of the special places that actually has decent preparation for Rosh Shalom, because it has an historic urban center where a lot of folks used to live and then were coming back to live. And they also had a suburban center, which I thought was the strangest thing I'd ever heard of until it started at Rosh Shalom. So it was good preparation. And do you have an exterior photo? Yes. Do you remember years ago, one of our Philadelphia Museum of Jewish Art exhibits was Jonathan Adler, who since became more of a name, and he created different ceramic pieces, vases that in some way evoked sanctuaries or sacred spaces. And one of the looks that he loves, if you can picture his work, is sort of it's like the opposite of scalloped. What do you call that? I don't know. But,
I don't know.
But you see how the exterior wall, you could sort of see
You can say scallop.
Scalloped. It's like a reverse scalloped thing and the exterior. And he based some of his designs on that
Interesting.
Exterior. So it was neat when he came to show his exhibit here to know one of his sources of inspiration there.
The fascinating thing about that photo on the left too is the scale. I mean, you can't tell, but the ark is the little thing in the middle, which is bigger than a person.
Right.
Those two things flanking the ark are these 30-foot high 10 commandment interpretations. So the scale of this thing is pretty dramatic, very extraordinary, a little weird, but The other thing that I find interesting about this is that the architects, Harrison and Abramovitz, were also the architects, the master planning architects for Brandeis University. Wait, Brandeis. And, you know, 10 years earlier, that's the Jewish chapel at Brandeis. And you can kind of see what they were thinking. It's the two walls on the side with glass in the middle. And I think they're pretty close cousins.
When I was on that ark at Temple Beth Zion, I will say, I never even noticed what you're talking about. The scale of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, I think is right.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be on the sides, and the windows. I think I was so focused on learning my stuff.
Yeah, right.
I don't think I noticed any of it. It was the first time I ever did, let's say a bar mitzvah, passing the Torah from generation to generation. That's all I could think about was the prayer book and the people in front of me.
You're gonna have to go back and look at it.
I really do now.
And I'm including this one for a couple of reasons. This is an ark. The sculptor is Louise Karsh, and the architect is Pietro Belushi. And the thing that I find interesting, those are all bronze panels. And I was always under the impression that you weren't supposed to have human images in a sanctuary, and they're all over this thing. So I'm not sure how that worked. But the other,
Well, we're supposed to not have so much of it. We have a little bit of animal imagery in ours in the
yes, I
in
heard
the
animals
tribes.
okay, but human.
Yeah, I mean, we don't do a ton of either though, right? Because we don't want
We
to
don't.
imply that we're worshiping.
Right.
Yeah.
But they didn't seem.
But they did a lot.
They did
Yeah,
a lot.
that's unusual.
Yeah. Now that's the exterior of the building. And if any of you find this familiar a little bit, this is Adith Israel out in Marion,
Yeah.
and it's the same architect. So he was into whatever that skylight thing is that he was working on that as part of his exploring synagogue design. Okay. So I want to talk about two case studies that we did that were really exciting for me personally anyway to work on these. Synagogue up in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was two Reform congregations that were merging. We do a lot of those, unfortunately, because they can't afford to stay in their building or whatever. So there was the big synagogue downtown, big Georgian extravaganza built like in the 30s, 40s, and that was way too big for what the congregation had become. And then there was a much smaller Reform congregation right on the edge of town in a very modest, very stark little modern building in a beautiful wooded site. And they decided that they were going to merge, and the bigger synagogue was going to sell their big building, and then we're going to renovate this smaller building to accommodate both congregations together. The synagogue downtown had this really beautiful big mahogany ark that you can see on the left too. And they really wanted to somehow keep it and move it. And this had an interesting quote above it also. This was the
That's it.
yeah.
It's Dalif Miat Haomed, which means know before whom you stand.
That's a common one too. You see that a lot.
Yeah.
I was telling Rabbi Maderer that while we were working on this thing, I had a woman come up to me and say, I really hope we're not keeping that ark. I find that quote so offensive. And I didn't know what the quote was when she was telling me this, so I didn't really have much to say to her. And then later I went and looked it up, and I was thinking, okay, why is that offensive? And you had an interesting explanation.
Well, I don't know why she thought it was offensive, but I think there's more than one way to think about the text. And I think, know before whom you stand could feel a little bit like God as Santa Claus or God as Big Brother. What did you say, Mark? Judge. Yeah. Like watch yourself. Right. And that's not how everybody wants to relate to God. And And so that's one possibility. I like the idea of its use human being to human being also. So know before whom you stand. Also, let's say we're inviting a guest speaker to Rosh Shalom, right? They should know a few things about Rosh Shalom. They should understand something about the congregation so that when they're speaking to us, they have a sensitivity about who we are. That's also a way to think about know before whom you stand.
You've turned it around, kind of like a mirror. That's really good. Okay. So this was their ark. And then the ark in the newer modern building that we were going to be renovating was, a nice pair of doors. Essentially, it was painted gold, and they somehow, wanted to keep theirs as well. So the first shot at this was they wanted us to figure out a way to combine these arks on the bima, and of course they did, and we came up with this. The other thing they wanted was to make sure that when you were sitting in your seats, there was kind of this focus towards the bima. It was a fairly plain room, as you can see on the left. The ark felt very far away, and there wasn't anything that was like pulling you in that direction. So they wanted to make sure that there was something that was heading in that direction. We did this thing in the ceiling, and we took the ark from the big congregation, and we set in the doors on either side of it, flanking the main ark, and said, "Here's this," and they liked it. But then they got a new rabbi, and the new rabbi said, "Why are we doing that? We're a new congregation. We shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as a merged congregation anymore. Let's design our own ark for who we are now." Sounded great. They wound up having an election to decide which way to go. And the new ark people won by one vote. So this wasn't exactly a mandate, and there was a lot of bad feeling. There's a lot of bad feeling about it, but we took on the job of coming up with a new ark. But somehow they wanted us to continue to honor these two arks somehow. Okay. So this is what we came up with. And the story behind this is, well, first of all, the criteria were they're in this beautiful setting with a lot of trees and pine trees and stuff. They wanted to bring the outside in. We added some more windows and things like that. And also we decided that wood was kind of an appropriate material here. And we still wanted to kind of focus things. And because it was such a kind of very low budget project, they were really struggling to have a good amount of money to build this thing. The ceiling we felt we needed to dress it up in some inexpensive but dramatic way. So in my office, when we're working on something like that, there's a team of people, and we sit and talk about what we think this should look like and how we want to do it. And there's usually a guy who's a really good designer, and they come up with a bunch of ideas, and we sit around and we look at them. And the guy I work with on a lot of synagogues, who's done a lot of the work that we do on synagogue, is a guy named Christian. And you can probably infer that he's not Jewish. And we kind of went over this, we talked about it, and he came back with this design. And we said, wow, that's pretty nice. And we looked at it, and the idea here that he came up with is if you look at a bird in flight, that red line shows the pattern of how the wings go when they're flying. And that those kind of things in the wood beams across the ceiling follow that same pattern. And he said, well, that's where he got the idea of doing this. And then he said, and he felt like this represented the words of Torah soaring out over the congregation. And I went, wow, you picked up a lot. You know your audience.
He's been listening.
He's been listening. So I said, so let's talk about this a little more. How many of those beams do you have going? He said, well, I guess I got around 20. I said, make it 18, and I think we have a design. So this is how it turned out. for not a lot of money. And the Bima furniture also was designed to go with that. So we have a reader's table and a candle table and a Torah stand that all work off of this same design. And the other two arks, the old ark wound up as a focus for they have a Beit Midrash. It's kind of a library, meeting room, conference room, chapel. And we built it into that. We had to alter it a little bit. It's a little shorter than it used to be. And the other doors, off to the right, you can see they flank a display cabinet in the lobby, where this is the only synagogue I've ever heard of that have Haftarah scrolls. Each scroll represents like a different prophet. And they have a whole collection of them, and they're in that cabinet. It's really interesting. Okay, and then another case study that we worked on is a synagogue in Harrisburg, Chizuk Emunah, which is a conservative congregation, and they had an old building in town, and somebody left the Shabbat candles on a Friday night, and it burned the synagogue down. So they needed to figure out what to do next, and we talked to them about, do they want to renovate? Do they want to build? Well, they decided they were going to move to a different site. They bought a piece of property and built a new synagogue. And this is kind of where, let me back up one. Okay, so the story here is that whenever you work on a project, the first thing they want are renderings of what it's going to look like, even though you haven't designed it yet, especially if it's getting close to the holidays and they want to have something in the lobby to show the congregation. So you have to come up with a bunch of ideas really quickly. And we were preparing some renderings of very early concepts for the building that would look pretty. And we wanted to do an interior of the sanctuary as one of them. And we got a call. It was a rabbi's wife who was on the building committee, and she said, hey, listen, this congregation is founded by a group that came from Lithuania, from the city of Kovno in Lithuania, and they all came from the main synagogue. Is there some way that we can reflect that founding group in the design of our synagogue? It's like, let's think about that. So we did a little research. We decided, okay, what did this building look like? And that was the main synagogue in Kovno. And we said, oh, that's a pretty nice little building. It's really, really pretty good. You know, that would make a terrific looking ark. So we came up with a design where we used their building as the design of the ark in the sanctuary.
Very clever.
We thought so too. Well, so we sent this along, it was like, 2 days before they wanted them in the lobby, and we sent them along, and we were really excited. We couldn't wait to get their reaction. And we called the next day to ask them if they got their boards and did they like it. And the president said, well, I really hated the ark. I said, really? Why? What? He said, I don't like kind of old looking things in new spaces, which I happen to really love. I mean,
Me too.
yeah, I love that contrast. And he said, I can't show this. I said, really? Okay. Well, he said, it's okay. We just won't have an interior. And I said, well, we want you to have an interior. I said, well, let's scramble a little bit. We'll figure out something. We'll see if we can get you something new. So we decided that if he didn't like something old, we would take that and reinterpret it as something a little more contemporary. So we came up with that, which kind of reflects the old one. It's not as good a connection. We didn't like it quite as much. But we showed that, and he said, okay, I can live with that. We'll have this on the Bima, in the lobby. Another criteria that they wanted was they had received a gift from a congregant of something called Yucca-Gainy glass. You probably have never heard of Yucca-Gainy glass. It's a glass that's made in a factory in Western Pennsylvania. It's kind of a swirly, patterny, colored glass that is somewhat opaque almost. It's a little translucent, comes in a lot of different colors. And they had lots of it, like pieces of it, and they wanted to somehow bring it into this ark. And in this rendering, we're showing it as part of the ark doors. Okay, fine. We come up with something eventually. So kind of hold on to that idea, and we'll get to that again later. So, so the next thing that happened was that it was a couple of months go by. We're designing, the building, and it's time to get back to the ark. This was just sort of early concept. So they had every time we went to a meeting there to meet with their building committee, the building committee was like 35 people. It was way too big. And every time you came to a meeting, it was a different group of those 35 because no one would ever come to the same meeting together. And so you would make a decision at one meeting, and then the next meeting, it would be different people who unmade the decision. So we were trying to design their ark, and we came up with a lot of designs. And this went on for weeks. And finally I said, we can't keep doing this. This is terrible. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to pick 4 people. And we're going to bring a few people from my office, and we're going to lock ourselves in the conference room and design an ark, however long it takes. They're going to decide the design, and everybody else is going to say, that's great. And so it was the rabbi, the president, and a married couple. She was an artist, and he was the synagogue's gabbai. So it was a good group.
I don't know if everybody knows what a gabbai is.
Go for it.
It's a lay leader, but who's helping with the ritual, and in particular, usually helping with the Torah service, and whoever's reading Torah, they're checking the Hebrew, but it's somebody who spends a lot of time on that bima and near that ark, right?
I learned the word at this place. So we said, okay, we're gonna design art, and we're gonna do it in this room with just these people. And it just so happened that the weekend before this meeting was going to happen, I visited for the first time the barns that had just opened on the Parkway. And I was sitting downstairs outside the gift shop, and I was looking at this staircase, and I was looking at the wood detailing on this thing, and the way it was kind of vertical things and that became open for the lower few feet. And I, for some reason, that really struck me as being kind of interesting. And I said, hey, this is starting to look like an idea for an ark. So I guess I had that on my mind. So I went to this meeting with a sketch. And the idea of this was that there would be these progressive panels that were made up of solid on the bottom that became those open slats at the top. And they would recede a bit. So there was depth to it. And that the front one would be the one shade of a colored wood, and they would change. It would be lighter and then darker. And those slats, the openings in the slats, remember yucca-gaini glass? That we could use the yucca-gaini glass cut up and placed inside these openings with the sunlight coming in behind it. So that was a sketch that came out of this meeting, and everybody really liked it. So that was what we went with. So we went home, came back, and did a bunch of renderings of what that could look like in their space. So this is the design of the ark. That was going to be like an iron gate that slid in front of the ark opening with a curtain behind it. And that, as you know, behind those panels in the sides were like shelves and places to put books and other things that you want to have on the bima. And that was the design that we went with. So here's some of the drawings that went into what this ark was going to look like when it was finished. And here it is being fabricated and brought into the synagogue. Turned out to be a lot bigger than you imagine it when you're kind of putting these things together. And they're erecting it in place. You can see how that's working. And there's the glass cut up into squares that are, we held it up in windows to kind of see how the light was going to work with it. And here they are on strips. So we kind of ordered it so they knew how to install it. And there it is.
That's beautiful.
And both, I talked to the president of the congregation after this, and when it was all done. And we both agreed that afternoon in that room was one of the most kind of powerful, amazing experiences we both had. It was magical. It really was, doing this and then seeing it get built. So the interesting thing is that it went a few years before they decided to put a door on this. They just used the curtain for a long time. We'd always seen there was going to be a track in that horizontal piece that the door slid behind. And finally, I didn't know this until I looked on their website, but they did actually hire somebody. Yeah, there it is from the front. Those are two of those two people who were in the conference room with us. She's amazing as an artist. Susan Levitan, if you go to her website, she does really spectacular Judaica. I really like her stuff, and she was really fun to work with. So here's another artist. That doesn't look like Susan. More Yucca-Gainey glass. I guess they had a lot of it. Putting together the ark doors, and it's I'm not sure what it says, but it is some Hebrew in there. With little pieces that she made into a mosaic. So they're all cut up into tiny little pieces. And there it is on the ark. So just one more image, and that is that as part of this new synagogue, besides having this sanctuary with the ark, we also had a chapel. It was kind of a Beit Midrash also. They do morning minyan and afternoon minyan and all that. And so they needed a smaller worship space. And it was this room. And it was the thing where it needed to have an ark, but we didn't want the ark to dominate the room because many times this was being used for something other than a worship service. So that's a wall of actually doors. Some of them are cabinets. Some of them one of them is an ark. One of them is actually a door to a storage room behind the ark. And one of them is a Torah holder for during the service. So I believe that is our presentation. And if anybody has any questions. Yes, Helen.
Going back to the picture that has it, you can see the different grids. Yeah, so it's so very beautiful. I'm wondering, was it evocative of something for you? Or just beautiful design?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of anything representational at all. It was basically just materials and kind of composition. And so I'm fond of things that aren't symmetrical but are sort of balanced. And so I wanted to keep the ark centered, but have other things going on behind it that show a certain amount of depth. And yeah,
it's less Barnes staircase now and more, the logo that the Kendall uses for the organ.
No, I don't know anyone. Is it?
Yeah, it reminds me of that too, but it's just stunning.
Thank you.
My favorite among them.
Thank you.
Michael, what was the gate you designed for that they didn't use?
That.
Also a tree.
Yeah, it was a tree. It was kind of a tree of life. It was literally just something we needed for a rendering. Yeah, we said, okay, well, we'll look good. Okay, let's do that. Which is 90% of design, It's like
Figure out which one they put up.
yeah, I was actually very surprised to see that they actually finally did something and that it was such a nice result. I mean, this was just basically saying it didn't have to be a door. It could have been a gate because it had a curtain, but they came up with the other thing on their own. And I thought it was really, really beautiful. Gary.
First of all, I love your work.
Oh, thanks.
It's a little off the subject, but probably one of the most controversial synagogue buildings anywhere. Beth Shalom.
Oh, yeah.
What's your opinion?
Well, it's Frank Lloyd Wright.
Say a little more
Yeah,
about it. Where it is.
It's the building, the one synagogue that Frank Lloyd Wright did. It's up on Old York Road in Elkins Park, I guess. And, it's legendary in that there's all sorts of things written about the relationship that Frank Lloyd Wright had with the rabbi. And, there are volumes written on it. They have actually an exhibit in the building that talks about their relationship and their correspondence and all that kind of thing. If you talk to just a rabbi, he designed the building, right? It's that kind of thing. But there's talk about it representing some kind of hat, which I don't think it did. All I know, it's spectacular when you're in it. Like much of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs, it's very impractical in many ways. The acoustics are terrible. It leaks like a sieve. They actually have like kiddie pools sitting around the room to catch water.
Well, they've changed that actually. Have you been there recently?
No, I've been a few years.
Potted trees. Really, it's
Yes.
great for their trees, and so the pots that the trees are in are underneath the leaves. So it goes right in.
Well, some of the kiddie pools were actually balanced on the tops of the pews, so I'm not quite sure how they got the trees in there. But some of the spaces don't work at all. But on a sunny day, you can't use the sanctuary on a hot summer day because it's so hot. I mean, the whole ceiling
It's like a greenhouse.
it's like a greenhouse, but it's beautiful. I mean, you walk in there, it's breathtaking. So, I always have mixed feelings about his stuff. It's beautiful, it's amazing, but a lot of it it doesn't work. People who have to use his buildings don't particularly like it, but it's great.
I feel the same.
Yeah. Benzion.
I was looking at the names of the buildings, and it seems to me the most common is something congregation or temple.
Yes.
And wondering if this reform movement have a preference to either the congregation or temple or and others, and also sort of others related to the old country,
Oh,
the country of origin.
The use of temple is avoided in Orthodox synagogues and many conservative, but not all, some conservative, because some believe that the term temple should be used only for the ancient temple in Jerusalem, the temple with a capital T. It's much more common in Reform synagogues to use temple or not, but it is common to use temple. And, Reform thinking that we're not attached to building a third temple in Jerusalem, or that's not the only temple. We're democratizing. It's the word. Democratizing the idea of the synagogue. I think here at Rhodes Shalom, I think we don't use temple so much because Temple University is a mile north, and I don't think it's a religious reason at all. I think it would just be very confusing. So I never say temple around here.
yeah, it's interesting because when I'm doing working with a synagogue, if they call themselves temple, I'm very careful in correspondence to refer to the temple rather than to the synagogue, because I'm not sure if I'm offending somebody by calling their temple a synagogue or calling their synagogue a temple. So
It probably it's only problematic the reverse, I think. If somebody says our synagogue, you don't want to call it the temple because you don't know how they feel about that term.
Yeah.
I don't know that synagogue bothers anybody.
Okay. Yeah. But I hear you. Yeah.
So the synagogue where Rabbi Maderer interned, the one with those huge soaring. So I was just curious, the Hebrew letters, I guess this is Ben Shon, they were so stylized.
Yeah.
I couldn't, what?
It's Anochi, low.
It's just that I think it's just meant to represent the 10 Commandments.
It's
The first word of each commandment.
the first line.
Yeah.
Most of them are low.
Yeah.
Right.
Bachor, Kabed,
Last one's up more.
Kabed.
Oh, nice.
All right. It's the first letter. You know,
It's common on ark doors, right? That the first letters of the.
well, it's not, it's common.
I've seen that.
The whole Ten Commandment tablet thing
Yeah.
is very common imagery there. There's some synagogues where the tablets are like half the facade on the outside, and they'll have some kind of Hebrew, either the first word or the first letter, or even Roman numerals sometimes, 1 through 10.
Oh.
You see those, which is a little weird.
Yeah.
And I've also been told that the traditional or the common tablet look that we see is actually a kind of a Christian image of the tablets.
The tablets with the curved top
Yes.
is a Christian interpretation artistically, and with the square top is a Jewish. And this is sort of the diagonal. I think is just Ben Shahn.
Yeah, exactly.
Where's the third tablet from Mel Brooks?
I know.
The other thing here is that are those lights at the top?
Yeah, those are light fixtures.
So that's kind of a nod to Frank Lloyd Wright from the Buffalo period, right? I mean, am I wrong? See it?
Interesting, yeah. I don't, did you remember what the stained glass, is it representational or is it just abstract?
Oh,
Or
I
don't
have
you
no
remember?
memory of it all.
Okay, cool.
No memory.
What's the material of those tablets?
That's a really good question. I'm guessing that it's probably some kind of plaster, painted plaster.
There's a question.
Oh, question for who?
What question, Harry, on this subject, what part did Ben Shahn do, she asks?
The ark and the tablets is Ben Shahn. Those 2 tablets.
Not the glass?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if he did the glass.
Can I ask another question? This is my.
Yeah.
So obviously to be an architect, you have this creativity. How do you balance like this creativity and being creative with such a traditional concept? I mean, do you have is there like I have to be careful, or how do you balance that?
Unfortunately, Wright did not.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. I guess in some ways it's experience of having done enough of something that you could understand your boundaries and your, where you're trying to go. And there's a lot of interpretation of stuff. I mean, we'll get an idea and think about like, does this seem appropriate? Is this something that would make sense, or would anybody find this to be not appropriate somehow? But usually, as we talked about earlier, there's so much in what we do here that's open to interpretation that there aren't a lot of limits. I mean, there's that, representation of the human form that you pretty much want to stay away from. But obviously somebody thought that was a good idea and nobody found that to be inappropriate. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
What do you think about our arks?
Oh, well, it's interesting. They're really nice. They're beautiful. They're very elaborate. Our ark in our sanctuary, fits into the ark architecture thing. And the ark that we have is the only interior feature in this building that reflects the exterior. Otherwise, they're totally different styles. The exterior and the interior have almost nothing to do with each other, except for the ark. If you look at the ark, the detailing around the ark is similar to the detailing on the exterior, but the rest of the room is a
On
different.
the Broad Street doors, what does it call out?
The stuff at the top, I guess they're sort of like crenellations or something.
On top of the Broad Street doors?
On top of the whole building.
It's like a fortress.
Yeah, like,
Oh,
Like Castle Restaurant.
I like your fortress thing.
I once did a talk on this a long time ago, that the exterior has a lot of like Assyrian overtones, Babylonian overtones. Because in that period, architects needed to have something they could relate their designs to. It had to be kind of interpretive. And it was during, Art Deco, and they reused all sorts of, symbolism from past eras. So our exterior has a lot of Babylonian, Assyrian stuff. The inside of our sanctuary is all Byzantine. It's from, that era, except for the ark. And the ark has a lot of that sort of Babylonian, Assyrian
So.
detail. Now, the ark in the chapel is in the category of cabinetry. It's a cabinet, you know, and it was original to the original chapel. But it doesn't have any particular relationship to the rest of the building. I don't know if they bought it and just kind of plunked it in there or somebody designed it specifically for that room. I'm not sure. But the rest of the furniture and the Bema chairs and the Nair Tamid and the reader's table are all from the original Road of Shalom that Frank Furness did on this site that we tore down. Anything else? Benzion?
In our synagogue, in the sanctuary, we have the priestly hands.
Yeah.
I know that, I think it's number 624, but where was the written, where was the graphic, the original graphic depiction of that?
Where's the
That's on
first
you.
time we see that? I don't know. It emerges as a gesture of blessing as the priestly, but where's the first time in art? Big question, because we don't have a lot of photography from that time.
Leonard Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah, Nimoy, right.
Yes. Jerry.
Since you brought it up, I have to tell you, because it's such a funny story. A friend of mine was the education director at Horace Zion, and he wanted his kids to come here because they're doing an heirloom museum or whatever, and he wanted them to see our museum in the Talheimer. He couldn't make it a few Sundays ago, so he asked me to take the kids around. So one of the arks, one of the shulchans that we use for different holidays, whatever, happened to be in storage out in the Talheimer lobby, like the real big one. So I didn't notice anything particular unusual going on. And then suddenly Elvin comes running out of the sanctuary where the cantor and the Hebrew school is having a service. And he says, Jerry, they're talking into the microphone, they're opening the arks. I don't know what you were talking about. Well, it turns out that table was live. The microphone was live, and the buttons on their remote control to the big ark doors.
And you were,
So they were opening and closing. So after the service was over, I took them in there as like the last stop in the building. And I said, I have a big surprise. And I said, watch this. And I opened the door. They said, it's not what we were doing. And that was the highlight of their visit.
well, you know, it's interesting because when we did that Orthodox synagogue in New Orleans, I was telling Rabbi Maderer, we had long debates over the water fountains because when you turn on a water fountain, it kicks on the refrigeration of the water, and you couldn't do that on Shabbat. And then I'm thinking, yeah, we have an ark where you push a button and the electric doors open. What would they think of that? But yeah, there aren't a lot of electric door arcs around, but those doors would be too heavy to open.
I know, on each of them.
Yeah, they're very, we when we renovated the sanctuary, can't remember how many years ago now, we had to restore that mechanism, which was not an easy task, and finding somebody to do that. So. Ellen.
So one of the synagogues you showed was an Orthodox synagogue, and it had a balcony. So in that synagogue, did the women sit in that balcony?
Apparently they did.
That's what it was. So it was, so they could see, there was no mechitza.
Right.
So
You don't need a mechitza if you have a balcony.
If there's a balcony, you don't need a mechitza.
You need a
Right.
mechitza if you're both on the same level.
Mechitza would usually be like a separation just down that middle aisle. And it would be maybe a curtain or a little wall or something like that.
But if you're outside, then you don't need it.
Right.
Yeah, well, the practice is as unequal as the practices. So the practice is that the men aren't supposed to see the women, but the women are allowed to see the men. So if the women are in the balcony, it's not a problem. They don't need anything else.
Yeah.
The men aren't looking up the balcony. They're looking at the service in the ark.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe Israel has the men here, and then the women are the next 3 rows, and they're just elevated by like a foot. And you can, the men can definitely see the women on the other side of the football field. They're
Probably
quite visible, and
more-
that's the Orthodox synagogue.
It's probably
Yeah.
more symbolic. But it's interesting. I mean, before I did the synagogue in New Orleans, I didn't know from mechitzas very much, and I learned a lot. And even mechitzas have an incredible range of how you can do it. I mean, there's a certain height thing, but it's pretty broad range. It could be made out of all sorts of stuff. I saw one modern synagogue where the mechitza was just a series of kind of poles down the middle as just symbolic separation. You could see right through them, but it was almost like a sculpture down the middle of the aisle. It gets pretty tricky though. Like when you come into the room, can the women walk past the men? Do the men walk past the women? You have to kind of come up with a route of how people get in and out correctly. So it's really interesting.
I was in a synagogue in Columbus, and it was set up like a movie theater, you know,
Yeah,
big section in the middle,
yeah.
and then 2 small sections. It was a combination of a conservative and an Orthodox synagogue. So the mixed seating was in the middle. The men were all over there, and the women were all over there. I thought that's like
Wow.
brilliant idea.
Huh, interesting.
Sort of like our mask only section. Make everybody happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people in the middle were the mechitza.
They were the mechitza.
Oh, that's really.
Yeah, I thought it was clever.
That's
Really.
wild.
Yes.
I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you know around the date of that Louise Nevelson?
I don't.
Oh, and Great Neck.
Yeah,
I've never
I'm guessing it was 60s. But
Yeah, it was kind of a moment in the 60s where all these Jewish artists
Yes.
were being commissioned
yes, you see a lot of,
to really interesting pieces.
and that was the exact time when congregations were moving out of the cities into the suburbs. And they were very creative about their buildings and had a lot of the artists from that period work on their buildings with them. Kara?
I'm also surprised how many have glass walls. And that could be some
Have what?
selecting glass
Yeah.
walls.
What does it say about Michael that he's choosing?
Right, they're choosing that one, and I guess most of them are not urban, but a lot of them were glass walls.
I like glass. Sion.
Is there a mandate that the ark be on the eastern wall?
Well, that's interesting too. It's customary. It kind of depends on the rabbi too. I mean, how strict they are about it. I mean, we always assume that it's going to be on the eastern wall, but we've been in new synagogues where they're not. And my first question is always, how did the ark wind up over there? And it's always a story, you know, well, whatever, you know, what. And in the city, it's more difficult to do that because you have this grid. And if you happen to be in a synagogue that's on the north side of, you know, Pine Street or something, it's going to be tough to get an ark on the eastern wall if the synagogue runs north and south. So there are a lot of, you know, looking the other way exceptions to where you put the ark. We always start with the assumption that it's going to be on the eastern wall, and some synagogues aren't quite as strict about it.
They also, if the ark is not on the east wall, there's a good chance that some congregations, when they stand for the Amidah or the Baruch Hu, they're turning,
Yeah.
so they make it happen.
Okay.
So they're not, they're not looking the other way in terms of practice. They're probably still practicing facing
Mhm.
east.
Mhm.
What was the artist name you were asking about?
Louise Nevelson.
Thank you.
Jewish.
Yeah, I think so. She's got a piece of the Federal Reserve Building or the
Yeah.
courthouse, whatever.
The federal courthouse.
Market.
Yeah.
Well, she had one at the back of the. No, the back of the art museum.
Oh, that's a different one. Dude.
Yeah, she had it there too, but it's been there too.
Philip repeated the giant spider, like a huge stuffed spider. Was that her?
Louise
Yeah.
Nevelson, really?
Nice picture.
Also, somebody different, you know, something.
All right. Well, we have 4 minutes. So does anybody have any other questions? There's nothing on the, okay. Great.
Right, so
Thank you for sharing your art with us. Yeah, absolutely. It's good to learn with you. Ellen, do you want to wrap us up?
I'm trying to find my wrap-up thing.
No problem.
Okay, so I'll just say thank you to Michael and Rabbi Maderer. This was such an incredibly meaningful, sort of rich class. I just loved it from every point of view. And thank you to Stephen and Jordan, our tech angel. At the end of the week, there'll be an evaluation form that we fill out. And we have one more class right after this, which is trip to Morocco with Rabbi Maderer and a panel, including Mon Kramer. And our classes continue Friday. So if you haven't registered already, I hope you'll take a look and register for some additional classes. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Now it works.
All right, now it works.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
To grab one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess you know the rabbi.
Do. I'm gonna go switch up my thing. Are we, Ellen or Stephen, are we doing a second table?
Yeah.
Okay,
We're gonna take the one that's.
okay, so I'm gonna